I'm going to try to go through this as fast as I possibly can. I may need to edit that a little, but I only want this to be one video rather than two, and I have a lot to say about this. Recently, Netflix came out with a live-action adaptation of the Winx Club series. It is called Fate, a Winx Saga, or The Winx Saga, I believe. And it isn't good. I do want to start by praising a few things. I think that it's very good that now specialists and fairies aren't defined by gender. I don't think that was a bad thing in the original series necessarily, but I do think it is a product of its time. And in that sense, time has moved on, and it's good that they adapted to this. This is sadly one of the very few things that I can say that I actually liked about the show, because that's kind of where the list ends, which isn't a good thing. So why don't I like this show? Well, for one, it's a dark and gritty reboot. I'm personally not a fan of many reboots. I think that the idea behind many reboots are lazy, and while I don't necessarily think that all reboots are bad, this is definitely one of them. And that I think that this particular case, it can very much be traced back to Riverdale, because ever since about 5 years ago, dark teen dramas have been very popular, and I feel like this show was definitely inspired by Riverdale. I even went to check if any of the people who worked on this show worked on Riverdale, because they remind me of each other so much that it is just ridiculous. One of the first things that stands out is the fact that they mention there will be no transformations. They phrase it as such a thing that it can be something that will happen later on in the series, and I definitely believe that will happen, but it also kind of feels like a smack in the face. I understand why they did it from budgetary reasons and things like that. There are so many changes made. I believe that when the series got its first photos out there was a little bit of controversy over whitewashing. The character of Flora is now a white girl, and in the original series, she is at the very least not white. I don't know what exactly her ethnicity is. It does seem that they changed that character based on that, because the character isn't actually called Flora anymore. But if you go back to things like the casting calls and how the character was originally listed, it was definitely meant to be Flora. Her powers are exactly the same, and they briefly mentioned that Flora is like a cousin of hers. I'll be honest, I don't know why they did this. Part of me can't help but feel that they made this character change because they wanted a plus-size girl, and I'm not saying that to be rude. This is something that the director or the showrunner at the very least mentioned, that it was important that there was a variety of how the girls looked, which is fair, but I can't help but feel that Flora could have been a non-white person, someone who I always sort of guessed was Latina maybe, or Latinx, and plus-sized at the same time. I don't see why those things need to be exclusive at all. It also kind of feels like just by renaming her Terra, they just kind of shove aside all the criticism, which seems like valid criticism. Initially, my first thought when I saw that was they made her a different character to not make Flora a plus-size girl. But I kind of also feel that the people who would get really upset that this was a person of color, had that been the choice, they're not going to watch the show anyway, so who gives a shit what they think. The cast is slightly different. Like I said, Flora isn't there, but Tecna also isn't there. I think that is okay, because I never really liked Tecna as a character, but it does seem strange, and I don't think we'll see her, mostly because of the setting of the show. There isn't much technology other than apparently Instagram being such a universal thing that even in other worlds they still have it, which seems very strange to me. I either embrace the current time setting and go for it completely, or don't. And one thing that Winx Club originally did, in my opinion, really well was mixing technology with magic, because that always seemed to sort of make sense. In a magically evolved world, it also makes sense that they have a very futuristic tech. I don't know why they don't have this, and this is going to build up to a criticism that I'll come back later. But getting back to the cast, so Flora isn't there, Tecna isn't there, and the character of Aisha is introduced now, whereas in the original series she was introduced until season 2. I think that's fair, but at the same time, I was a little confused about who she was. Turns out that the character has been called Aisha before, but she was also called Layla for a moment. And I got to know her as Layla back in the day. Her powers were also slightly different. Layla was able to use some form of slime or something, and Aisha seems to be able to use water. Again, I feel that that's a completely normal change, and I'm not upset about that. But it when you adapt a series like this, you do expect to see the original cast members. And I'm not saying Aisha shouldn't have been there. I'm completely okay with that, but it does raise questions like where are Tecna and Flora, and that is something that is just weird. There's a number of other missing characters. The Tricks aren't there, at least not in their form as we're used to them being three sisters or something like that. There's a character who is called Beatrix, and I do believe that that name is in reference to the Tricks, but also she's a fairy. Witches don't seem to exist in the way that we're used to. We also get to see the Specialist, who are now only reduced to Sky and Riven. There used to be at least two other characters in the first season, those being Timmy and Brandon, and also Helia in the second season. I believe his name was Helia, I'm not entirely sure. They're just gone. There's some weird love triangle with Stella, Sky, and Bloom, which in my opinion is stupid. They didn't need to do this. Like in the original series, the only love triangle was between Musa, Riven, and one of the Tricks. I feel like the series didn't need a love triangle at all. They just should have gone for an extra character that Stella was interested in that was friends with Sky, as they did in the original series. This just feels like unnecessary drama for drama's sake, and when you see what the series sets up on a much larger scale, it feels like that drama shouldn't matter at all. There's a very weird scene where Bloom is talking to Aisha, and she's talking about like her mother. Her mother wanted a cheerleader, and she says, well, I'm the opposite of a cheerleader, whatever that is. I felt that they might as well have just said, I'm not like other girls, because that is exactly what she's implying. It's a stupid line. The whole idea behind that sort of thing is stupid and needs to be retired, in my opinion. There's one thing that also really stands out, and that is that everyone is just an asshole in this show, except for Tara. But also that is very weird. Like, everyone is super rude to each other. Bloom and Sky seem to have this flirty thing going on, but they're still rude about it, which seemed very strange to me. And everyone is sort of just acting like an asshole. Musa at one point gets called out by Tara, and she explains like, well, I am a mind fairy, so I hear other people's emotions, and that gets really overwhelming. Okay, that makes sense, but why is everyone else an asshole? And speaking of Musa and Tara at one point, she talks with Musa, and Musa sort of says, well, I can sort of see that you're putting up a facade, this happy character that loves everyone and everything. And yeah, when we look at the end of the season, she's still just doing that. I'm really not sure what they're trying to imply. Like, is she nice or isn't she? Like, you can't have this both ways. They're extremely contradictory. Speaking of Tara, during one of the earliest scenes, there is a party with the Specialist. The fairies are attending. She starts talking to this guy, and Riven sort of interrupts. Riven and Tara know each other, and it's sort of implied that Riven has been bullying her. But for us, the audience, this is the first time we see them interact at all, and Riven says something that I personally thought wasn't even that offensive, and her reaction to this is to choke him with her magic. So again, the implication is this has been happening for a longer time, but what we see in that moment is that she chokes a guy because he made one off remark to her. That's not a good sign for her. That's a huge red flag. And I know that the show didn't mean it like that, but it does come off that way, and they needed to have seen that. The overall setting of the show is just extremely stupid, in my opinion. winxclub, while it has many faults in both its story and its visuals, it also always had a sort of charm in how colorful it was, and I think that they could have adapted that just fine for a more adult story. They tried to make it darker, but they ended up making it literally dark. At one point, the characters mentioned to have a green jacket, And I didn't even realize he was wearing green, not even when they say, oh, that's him right now, and he's wearing the jacket. If they hadn't pointed that out, I would have just thought that the jacket was like black or something. They ended up literally making the show darker. The school is gray. There's just a lot of gray, sort of saturated greens and browns, which just feel completely out of place. Like, this is supposed to be some magical world, and it doesn't need to look colorful, but it also needs to be said you can do colorful and dark at the same time. Visuals are important to the story, yes, but making those two things work together could have been a really amazing setting, and they just wasted. I also already addressed, like, they have smartphones, which was just weird to me, but there's just references to weird things. One character mentions Enya, who's a singer that pretty much no one at the age of 16 knows who that is, so why does he? They mention Instagram a ridiculous amount. For some reason, everyone knows who Harry Potter is. Okay, is that a universal thing? I kind of feel like it shouldn't be, but whatever. Tinkerbell apparently existed as a real fairy. That's okay, just going with that, I suppose. And finally, I want to address the villain. There isn't really a clear-cut villain in this series, other than the burnt ones, which are hordes of CGI faceless creatures that have about zero impact in total. They should have gone for different enemies altogether. Like, the burnt ones are not interesting. They're some kind of zombie. They try to build up tension, but it just isn't there because we don't actually see much of them, and whenever we do see them, they're just these mindless creatures. Like I said, Beatrix is sort of meant to be a villain, but also you get the idea by the end of the series, some things get revealed, and you sort of get the idea of, well, she thinks she's doing a good thing. Alright. It's revealed that one character who gets introduced later on, she's sort of set up as the villain for next season, but also you get to hear some of her motivations. So in that sense, she seems more like an anti-hero than an actual villain. All in all, I really question why the series was made and for who it was made. And by why, I don't mean they didn't need to make this, they just didn't need to make this a winxclub series. Like they said, the original audience of the original show, that was who this was for. Despite not being the target audience for that, being both a male and somewhat older than most people who might remember Winx fondly. I wasn't the original target audience, but I did enjoy the show for what it was. I don't look back on it now thinking it's a great show, but that's beside the point. I look at this show and I think there's no need to make this Winx. Like, they named a few of the characters, they don't mention the name Winx at all. Many of the characters are changed, characters are missing. Things just don't look like they're supposed to. They could have just done an original series that involved magic, fairies, specialists, wizards, things like that. And I don't know why they didn't. Other than, obviously, it generates clickbait. And it does feel like this was just something that was stacked on, like they had an original story, and then they decide, well, what if we name it this and tweak it just a little bit so it fits into that category? Which is a ridiculously stupid thing to do, and again, they should have just made an original series out of this rather than a Winx series. Ultimately, do I think the show is bad? No, not really. I enjoyed it for what it was, which for me was mostly a background sound. That's not a good thing, and I say that despite having sort of enjoyed it, but being good and being enjoyable are vastly different things. I had this on as background sound while I worked on other things, and in that sense, it did its job. It entertained me. I'll probably check into season 2, but overall, I can definitely say I felt more annoyed by many of the things than actually liking them. There weren't really any moments where I thought, oh wow, they adapted that to live action. There weren't really any moments that I particularly thought stood out. The CGI is mostly fine throughout the series. I do hope they get a bigger budget so that maybe we can see transformations. But all in all, I don't recommend watching this. I can't recommend this in good faith to you. If you want an enjoyable story, if you want a good story, if you want interesting visuals, this isn't it.